Hello, my name's Tim Shoebridge and welcome to this video, which is part 3 of my look at the Dreadbox Erebus version 3. Now in this particular video I want to look at patching of the synthesizer. It's a semi-modular synthesizer. It's got a load of patch points. I'm not going to go and look at every single patch point. That's not really what I want to do with these videos. I'm going to pick out some of the ones that are of interest to me, pick out some of the more unusual ones, and let's see what they do. And I'm going to start with the music that I played right at the beginning of this video. That was 3-note paraphonic mode on the Erebus, and I'm going to describe to you next how I basically patch the synthesizer to create that music. So that's what's coming up next. Thanks very much for watching. Okay, so this is the way that I patched the Erebus to create that drone sound at the very beginning of the music. There's quite a few patch points being used here, and it looks a bit complicated. It's not really, but actually what I'm going to do is strip away everything other than the red and yellow cables, because that's just what I want to cover to start with. Okay, so here we've got 3 red cables and 1 yellow cable. The red cables are going into the 3 CV ins that are provided on the synthesizer to control the pitch of each of the oscillators individually. So we've got a CV in 1, CV in 2 and CV in 3. If we wanted to just affect the pitch of all of them together, we could use this patch point here, but they have provided the individual oscillator patch points, which is really nice. This yellow cable is going into the gate. Obviously it's not a polyphonic synth, it's a paraphonic synth, so we can provide 3 separate pitches but only 1 gate input. So if I just tilt the camera up so you can see where those cables are coming from, I've got a Eurorack case. Ignore all the other synthesizery bits that are there. This particular module here, which I've talked about in previous videos a couple of times, it's basically a MIDI to CV converter. So there is a MIDI cable here coming in from my keyboard, and then I've got 3 CVs coming out and 1 gate coming out. So it's basically a MIDI to CV converter, which is capable of up to 4 notes at the same time, basically, this particular module. Whereas the Erebus itself, the MIDI to CV converter inside it, is only capable of two notes at the same time. Okay, so let's recreate the patching that was on that original drone sound. Now, in the very first video, I think it was, when I was talking about the synthesizers and the oscillators, I was actually a little bit critical of the fact that there are not separate level controls for each of the oscillators. You've got this mixing control here between 1 and 2, and oscillator 3 has its own independent level control. And what I was finding was that because oscillators 1 and 2 are always on sort of like full volume, I was finding that it was sometimes difficult to mix in oscillator 3 the way that I wanted to. So what I found is that there's an easy way to boost the volume of oscillator 3. If I just play a note, turn off those 2. So we're just listening to oscillator 3 here. And I take a patch cable that's going to go into this patch point here called in/filter. It's basically going to inject audio into the signal, the audio signal path just in front of the filter. And I take that and I take the output from oscillator 3. It's got a boosted volume to it. So that's the first patch point that I made, and I pretty much keep that in there all the time. So let's put the other oscillators in. Okay, now for patching number 2. And what I wanted to do with this drone sound was to get some nice sort of like gentle modulation going, and I wanted to use the LFO to modulate the pulse width of oscillator 1, which is set to square wave, and oscillator 3, which is on a double saw waveform. The double saw waveform as well as the square wave are pulse width modulatable. So that requires that I take a patch cable, taking the LFO output, and then I want to patch that to both of these two here, pulse width 1 and pulse width 3. So I could come out of there, go into the mult, and then go from the mult into both of those patch points. 1, 2. But that's not exactly how I had the synthesizer set up. What I like to do with the LFO is actually go through this little circuit here, which is an independent voltage controlled amplifier. And the reason I like to go through that is because I use the LFO quite a bit for vibrato, but I like to have it really subtle. And what I find is that this control here, this depth control, is quite sort of brutal. But if I go through this little amplifier circuit here, it's got a little attenuator, and I can actually sort of like dial back the effect of the modulation that I'm applying. So I'll show you that now. Basically what I'm going to do is take the LFO and put it into this little amplifier circuit. And the amplifier circuit has gotten a little attenuator, so you can sort of dial back the amount of the signal that's going through it. It's actually got two outputs. It's got a positive and a negative, so this is like an inverted waveform and the natural waveform, and that's quite handy. So I can take one of them and go into one of my pulse width inputs, and I'll take the negative waveform and go into the other one. So I'm using an inverted wave to modulate one of the pulse widths and the regular wave to modulate the other one. And then I can sort of set this where I want to, so that I don't have to worry about the tiniest of movements right down the bottom here, which is generally what you end up doing for vibrato. I can sort of like turn the attenuator right down and then use the whole width of this control. So I think that's how I basically had it for this particular drone. Okay, so the way that I bring that drone sound to life, I'm just going to play a chord and hold it down. So I start off with this mixer slider all the way over here to the right, which means that you're not hearing oscillator 1, only oscillators 2 and 3. So if I just increase the cutoff so we can hear them. Then what I did was slowly introduce oscillator 1, which gives it the third note. Then increase the depth of the LFO, which will start the modulation of the pulse width of 1 and 3. Then I've got down here the envelope that's affecting the filter. It's looped with quite sort of like a fast attack and decay. So as I bring that level up, we'll start to hear a fluttering sound. But first of all, I just reduce the cutoff so that it's going to be more easily heard. Okay, so I've got the synth back on my desktop. I've got the CV and gate leads unplugged, and I'm back on MIDI cable. I just want to come back to this voltage controlled amplifier circuit here. There's one aspect of it which I haven't covered yet. As well as having an input and two outputs that can be attenuated, there's also a CV connection here. And this CV allows you to modulate the volume of the signal as it passes through the circuit. Now, all of the Dreadbox synthesizers, the Erebus 1, 2 and the NICs, they provide a mod output. So this is from the modulation wheel. So it's part of the MIDI to CV circuit. They're providing CV and gate, but also they're providing the modulation wheel. And so what you can do is use the modulation wheel to, for example, increase, decrease the depth of the LFO using this little VCA circuit here. And the way you do that is take your LFO output and put it into the amplifier circuit, then take the output from that circuit and then modulate whatever it is you want to modulate. Let's say we want to modulate the pitch across all three oscillators and have a vibrato effect. Then we can take the CV and connect it up to the mod. So you can't see the mod wheel unfortunately, but if I hold down a note, that's with no mod wheel effect at all, and then as I lift up the mod wheel, that's at maximum. It's quite extreme. Unfortunately, if I turn this little attenuator all the way down to 0, which I have to really, still the effect of the mod wheel is quite dramatic, and that's because the signal coming from the mod wheel output is really quite dramatic. You can see here I've got the depth almost down to 0. If I move it a little bit further down, it'll actually go out of range, and now it's not doing anything at all. So it is actually quite delicate to find the right point. Not quite yet. There. But there you go. So using this amplifier circuit with its CV, it allows you to modulate a modulation signal, basically. Right, just one last example of using this attenuator circuit. If you want to play the filter, so not have any oscillators playing at all, but just rely on the full resonance of the filter, it's not going to track the keyboard at all unless you patch it somehow. So we have a cutoff frequency input here, and it would be nice, wouldn't it, to just go from there and take the CV out for the notes that we're playing, and it would work. Now you can't see the keyboard here, but although it makes a nice tune, it's not tracking the keys in any way, shape or form. So by using this little attenuator amplifier circuit and playing around with that attenuation, you can get it to sort of approximate within a sort of like a narrow range on the keyboard. So what we do is we take the CV, put it into this circuit, take the output, and then put that into the cutoff. Now I've been playing around with this a little bit. It should hopefully be roughly correct. These little pots, they're really quite difficult to control, I have to say. They're very fiddly, but that's supposed to be an octave. It's not, is it? Let's just see if we can. You can hear how it sort of like shifts about. Let's bring in oscillator 3 because we've got full control over the level of it, and see how well it tracks. Hang on, let's just tune it. So that's over a 2-octave range. You can hear that at either end it's definitely out, but for about an octave in the middle, it's not bad. So that's just one more example of using this little circuit here. Right, next I'm going to cover 2 circuits here. We've got a little analog clock here down the right hand side, and we've also got a sample and hold circuit in the middle. Let's just cover the clock first. It's an analog clock. It's a little bit like an LFO with a kind of a, well, with a square wave basically. You've got a manual rate control here, or you can affect the rate via some kind of CV input here. And then this little dial here is called duty cycle. It's like changing the pulse width of the wave. And then the clock is spat out of this little output. It's also normal to some other stuff in here, of which the sample and hold circuit is one of those things. So if we just try out the sample and hold circuit, because it's nice to have random sounds out of a synthesizer. The sample and hold circuit has got an input, so it needs some kind of input, and it's normal to the noise circuit that's inside the synth, so we generally don't have to worry about that. We can put our own clock into it, but it's normal to the analog clock, as I mentioned earlier. Here's the output, and then there's a little attenuator here, a little level control as to how wide the waveform is that it generates. So if we take the output and just put it straight into the CV, if I hold down a note, we should hear, so I increase the level. That sort of classic sample and hold. And if I increase the rate of the clock, we get that, which is fair enough. Now that's obviously me having to hold down a note, but if I wanted it to sort of like gate every time there was a change in that pitch, then what I can do very simply is just take the output from this clock and put it into the gate input, and now we're getting gated signals. And then of course we can play around. Like that. Very easy. Now if we wanted to, I don't know, randomize the rate of the clock, then what we can do is take that same sample and hold output, and as well as putting it into the CV, we could also modulate the clock with it. So we'd need to use the little mult circuit that we've got down here. Just take it out, put it into the mult, and then a couple more cables. So one of them is going to go back into the CV, so we're back where we were, and then the other one can then go into the clock. So we're getting sort of semi-random changes in the clock frequency. Right, there's one more circuit that I'm going to show you, and that's this circuit here. It's called a switch circuit. To be honest with you, I haven't come across one of these circuits before, and I've been racking my brains for a good use for it, and I haven't really come up with anything other than one. What it is basically, it's got two inputs, X and Y, and based on the clock, it will either take X or Y. It'll basically be switching between them, and it'll be outputting the result to Z. It can also work in reverse, so it can take a single input, and based on the clock it will split out the signal to X and Y depending on the clock cycle. So let's just use it as two inputs to one output. There are two audio outputs here available. There's oscillator 3 and there's noise source. So let's take the noise source into X and oscillator 3 audio output into Y. So then based on the clock, we're going to be getting either one of those coming up from Z. So let's take Z and put it into the audio path just before the filter. And let's see what that sounds like when I hold down a key. Obviously the clock rate is constant here, but we can modulate it based on, say, the CV, so the frequency that, or the note that I'm holding down. So let's take the CV and modulate the clock. Lots of sort of like cross-mod type sounds coming from it, which is basically sort of an emulation, if you like, of the sort of the triple ring circuitry that's going on there, which is switching between oscillators 2 and 3. What we've got here is switching between 3 and the noise source.